You're going to die. I'm going to die. Every person you love is going to die. And here's what terrifies me most after spending 84 years on this earth. Most of us will die having never truly lived. We'll reach the end, having spent our precious days collecting things that rust, impressing people who never really saw us, and running from the very adventures that could have made us feel alive. I've watched men chase fortune until their hearts gave out. I've seen women sacrifice their dreams on altars built by other people's expectations. I've held the hands of the dying, and I can tell you this with absolute certainty. Nobody, and I mean nobody, whispers on their deathbed that they wish they'd been more cautious, more obedient, or more normal. They weep for the chances they didn't take. They mourn the words they never spoke. They grieve for the person they never allowed themselves to become. That sound you hear? That's your own mortality knocking. The question isn't whether it's coming. The question is whether you'll answer the door having actually lived, or whether you'll open it with trembling hands full of regrets and a heart full of what-ifs. Let me be direct with you. I'm not here to make you comfortable. I'm here because I've seen what happens when we sleepwalk through our one wild, irreplaceable life. I'm here because I spent decades watching brilliant souls dim their own light to fit into boxes that were never meant for them. And I'm here because, if you're watching this, some part of you already knows you're capable of something more, something truer, something that would make your heart pound with meaning. This isn't about success the way the world defines it. This isn't about money or fame or having strangers applaud your carefully curated life. This is about that feeling you get at 3 in the morning when you're alone with yourself and the masks come off and you wonder if this is really it. If this is all you're going to be, I'm here to tell you that it doesn't have to be. But I'm also here to warn you. Time is not neutral. Every day you wait is a day you'll never get back. Every moment you spend being someone you're not is a moment stolen from the person you could become. I've lived long enough to recognize a simple pattern. The people who arrive at death with peace in their hearts are never the ones who played it safe. They're never the ones who colored inside every line, who followed every rule, who made themselves small to keep others comfortable. The peaceful ones are the people who dared, who failed, who got back up, who spoke their truth even when their voice shook, who loved even when love seemed foolish, who created even when creation seemed impossible. They're the ones who understood something profound. We're not here to arrive at death safely in a pristine, well-preserved body. We're here to skid in sideways, used up, worn out, scars proudly displayed, shouting what a magnificent ride it's been. But here's what breaks my heart. Most of us know this already. Deep down, you know it. You've always known it. Yet knowledge without action is just elaborate self-torture. It's knowing the cage door is unlocked while choosing to stay inside. It's seeing the path while refusing to take the first step. And that's why I'm speaking to you today. Not as some distant historical figure carved in marble, but as someone who understands the weight of human hesitation. As someone who spent years of my own life trapped between who I was and who I needed to become. I'm here to help you understand why you're stuck, what's really holding you back, and most importantly, how to break free before it's too late. Because I promise you this, the cost of staying safe is always higher than the cost of daring greatly. The pain of discipline is temporary. The pain of regret is forever. And if you leave this moment unchanged, if you close this video and return to the comfortable numbness of your routine, you'll be making a choice. Not to decide is to decide. Not to change is to choose exactly what you already have. And if what you already have filled your heart with purpose and peace, you wouldn't have clicked on a video with this title. Something in you is hungry. Something in you knows there's more. Something in you is ready. Let me take you back to Philadelphia, 1761. I'm standing in my printing shop, 55 years old, supposedly successful by any measure the world cares about. I'd built businesses, published papers, and amassed comfortable wealth. People knew my name. They quoted my almanac. They bought my products. And I was absolutely miserable. Not the obvious kind of miserable, where you can point to what's wrong. The insidious kind, where everything looks fine from the outside while your soul slowly suffocates on the inside. I had everything I thought I wanted and nothing I truly needed. Every morning I'd wake before dawn, as I always had, but instead of excitement, I felt dread. The same conversations, the same transactions, the same careful dance of maintaining reputation and meeting expectations. I'd become a prisoner of my own success, trapped in a life that fit me like shoes 3 sizes too small. And the worst part? I'd built the prison myself. Nobody forced me. I'd chosen safety over truth, predictability over passion, approval over authenticity. Brick by brick, compromise by compromise, I'd constructed a beautiful cage. There was a moment, I remember it viscerally, when I was standing at my window watching the sun rise over the Delaware River. The light was hitting the water in this particular way, turning everything gold, and I felt this surge of something I couldn't quite name. Not happiness, not sadness, something deeper. A kind of existential alarm bell. A voice that said, "Is this it? Is this all you are? All you'll ever be? The successful printer who played it safe?" I was 55, and I suddenly realized I'd been living someone else's idea of a good life. Not a bad life. Not a failed life. Just not my life. That morning changed everything. Because I made a decision that terrified me. I decided to step away from the business that defined me. To stop doing what was safe and start doing what was true. To risk the reputation I'd spent decades building in pursuit of something I couldn't even fully articulate. People thought I'd lost my mind. Comfortable men in their 50s don't abandon successful businesses to chase ideas about electricity and governance and human nature. They don't risk ridicule. They don't start over. But I'd glimpsed something in that sunrise moment, and I couldn't unsee it. The only failure that truly matters is dying with your music still inside you. The next years were chaos. Beautiful, terrifying, alive chaos. I conducted experiments that people mocked. I proposed ideas that seemed impossible. I failed spectacularly and publicly. And you know what I discovered? That aliveness, that sense of being fully engaged with your own existence, that feeling of waking up curious instead of dreading the day, that was worth more than all the comfortable success in the world. I'd spent 30 years building a life that looked good. I spent the next 30 years building a life that felt true. And the difference wasn't subtle. It was the difference between existing and living. Now here's what I need you to understand. I'm not special. I don't have the courage you don't have. I don't have abilities you lack. The only difference between the person who transforms their life and the person who dies with regret is this. One person acted on what they knew to be true, and the other one waited. One person decided that the pain of growth was preferable to the pain of stagnation. One person looked at the gap between who they were and who they could become and said, "I'm going to cross that gap, no matter what it costs." That's it. That's the whole secret. Not talent. Not luck. Not perfect circumstances. Just the willingness to begin. And I see you right now, wherever you are, whatever you're facing. Maybe you're young and feel like you have all the time in the world, so you keep postponing the life you actually want to live. Maybe you're older and feel like it's too late, like the best parts of life have passed you by. Maybe you're somewhere in the middle, successful enough to be comfortable but not fulfilled enough to be happy. Maybe you know exactly what you need to do, but fear has convinced you that you're not ready, not qualified, not enough. I see you, and I'm here to tell you that fear is a liar. It will always tell you to wait. Wait until you're more prepared, more educated, more confident, more secure. Wait until the timing is perfect. But perfect timing is a myth we tell ourselves to avoid imperfect action. The truth is this: you'll never feel ready. The moment you're waiting for doesn't exist. There is only now. This moment. This choice. This breath. What are you going to do with it? Because here's what I learned about regret. It doesn't come from the things you tried that didn't work out. Failure hurts. Yes. But it's a clean pain. It's the pain of growth, of learning, of becoming. Regret is different. Regret is the dull, persistent ache of knowing you never tried. It's the ghost of the life you could have lived, haunting the life you settled for. It's looking back and seeing all the moments you chose fear over faith, comfort over courage, other people's expectations over your own truth. And that kind of pain doesn't heal. It compounds. It grows heavier with each passing year until you can barely breathe under the weight of all your unlived life. I've sat with dying men who built empires and left nothing but money behind. No changed lives, no grateful communities, no legacy of love or meaning. Just zeros in bank accounts and children who knew their inheritance but not their father. I've held the hands of women who spent their entire lives being who they thought they should be, and in their final days, they wept for the woman they never allowed themselves to become. The artist who became an accountant, the adventurer who became a housewife, the truth-teller who learned to smile and nod. And the heartbreak wasn't that they chose wrong. The heartbreak was that they never really chose at all. They just drifted. They just complied. They just accepted what was given, instead of reaching for what was possible. Is that what you want? Because that's where you're headed if you don't change course. Not because you're broken or weak or lacking, but because that's what happens when we live on autopilot. When we let fear make our decisions. When we prioritize comfort over growth, you drift toward regret, the same way a boat without a rudder drifts toward rocks, not through any dramatic failure, just through gentle, persistent neglect of your own truth. So let me ask you directly, what would you do if you knew, with absolute certainty, that you only had 5 years left? Not someday. Not eventually. 5 years. What would you stop doing immediately? What would you start tomorrow? Who would you finally tell the truth to? What dream would you stop postponing? What fear would suddenly seem smaller than your desire to feel fully alive? Now here's the uncomfortable truth. You don't have unlimited time. None of us does. 5 years might be generous. 5 years might be a fantasy. We walk around pretending we're immortal, that there's always more time, always another chance, always tomorrow. But tomorrow is a promise the universe never made to you. The good news? You don't need 5 years. You don't need perfect circumstances. You don't need permission or approval or ideal conditions. You need this: the willingness to be honest about what's true, the courage to take one step, then another, the faith that you're capable of more than you've shown yourself so far. That's it. That's all transformation requires. Not some dramatic personality overhaul, not superhuman willpower. Just the decision to stop lying to yourself about what you really want, and the commitment to do one true thing today. Let me tell you what's possible when you make that choice. When you stop living for applause and start living for alignment. When you stop asking, what's safe, and start asking, what's true, everything changes. Not overnight, not magically, but deeply, authentically, permanently. You wake up curious instead of anxious. You engage with your life instead of escaping from it. You build things that matter instead of collecting things that decay. You connect with people who see you, instead of performing for crowds who only see your mask. You become someone you respect, someone you'd be proud to meet, someone who can look in the mirror without flinching. And here's what nobody tells you about that transformation. It's hard. Really hard. There will be days when you question everything. Days when going back to your old life seems easier than continuing forward. Days when fear whispers that you've made a terrible mistake. Those days will come, but they'll be followed by other days. Days when you catch yourself smiling for no reason. Days when you realize you've become the person you needed when you were younger. Days when someone tells you that your courage permitted them to find their own. And those days make everything worth it. Now I'm going to share with you the principles I discovered. The lessons that turned my own life from comfortable numbness to purposeful aliveness. These aren't theories. They're not philosophical abstractions. They're the hard-won wisdom of someone who watched countless fortunes built and destroyed, who saw friends rise from nothing and fall from everything, who learned that true wealth isn't just about accumulation, it's about understanding the invisible forces that govern prosperity. Let me share something that still haunts me from my printing days. There was a merchant, I'll call him Thomas, who made more money in a single year than I made in 5. He had the golden touch. Every venture succeeded. Every investment paid dividends. He wore the finest clothes, dined at the best establishments, and everyone in Philadelphia knew his name. I remember standing in his shop one afternoon, admiring the mahogany fixtures and brass fittings. "Thomas," I said, "you've built something remarkable here." He smiled, but there was something hollow in it. "Benjamin, let me tell you a secret. I'm drowning." I didn't understand at first. How could someone so successful be drowning? He explained. Every coin that comes in already belongs to someone else. The creditors, the suppliers, the landlord who charges triple what you pay because I can afford it. I look wealthy, but I'm a prisoner of my own success. I can't stop. The moment I slow down, the whole thing collapses. 2 years later, it did collapse. A single bad shipment, one investment that soured, and the house of cards fell. Thomas lost everything not because he was foolish, but because he'd built his prosperity on sand, not bedrock. I learned more from watching Thomas fall than from most of my successes. He had money, but he didn't have wealth. He had income, but he didn't have security. He had the appearance of prosperity, but he didn't have its substance. This is what I mean when I say most people don't understand money. They chase it without understanding what they're really chasing. They confuse the symptom with the disease, the shadow with the substance. Real wealth isn't measured in how much flows through your hands. It's measured in what remains when the flow stops. It's the difference between a river and a reservoir, between activity and accumulation, between looking rich and being secure. The shopkeeper on Market Street appeared prosperous, an expensive wig, a fine coat, always smiling and generous with credit. Then came the downturn. Within 3 months, his shop was shuttered, his goods auctioned to pay debts. He'd been spending tomorrow's profits today, building a facade instead of a foundation. Compare him to the Cooper down the street. Modest dress, simple habits, and lived in the rooms above his workshop. That same downturn barely touched him. Why? Because he'd built reserves. Every good month, he set aside a portion. Not buried in a hole, mind you, but working lending at interest, investing in sound ventures, purchasing the building he once rented. When hard times came, he didn't just survive. He expanded. Bought equipment from desperate sellers at reasonable prices, hired skilled workers, grateful for steady employment. When prosperity returned, his capacity had doubled, while his debts remained zero. This is the power position you're building toward. Not just survival, but strategic opportunity. The wealthy don't get wealthy during boom times alone. They get wealthy by having resources when others are in desperation. I learned this viscerally in my printing days. Paper was expensive, payment was slow, and competition was fierce. The printers who failed weren't necessarily less skilled. They were less prepared for the gaps in revenue. They'd invest everything in new equipment or expand too quickly, leaving no cushion for the inevitable dry spells. I took a different approach. When a good contract came through, I didn't immediately plow those profits into expansion. First, I ensured I could operate for 6 months with zero revenue. Only then did I consider growth investments. This boring approach meant I grew slower than some competitors initially, but I was still growing when they were liquidating. The mathematics are ruthlessly simple. If you spend everything you earn, you're one disruption away from catastrophe. If you save 5%, you're building slowly but building. If you save 20%, you're creating options and opportunities. If you save 40% or more, you're compressing decades of security into years. But here's what most people miss. Saving isn't about deprivation. It's about value alignment. Every dollar you keep is a dollar voting for your future self. Every dollar you spend thoughtlessly is a vote for immediate gratification over long-term freedom. The question isn't, how little can I live on? The question is, what do I genuinely value? And am I spending accordingly? Because here's what nobody tells you about frugality. It's not about denying yourself joy. It's about refusing to let marketing departments define what joy means for you. I see it everywhere. People are buying sports cars they can't afford because television told them that's what success looks like. People are carrying designer bags while their retirement accounts sit empty because Instagram influencers made luxury seem like a personality trait. People are going into debt for weddings that last one day, vacations they'll barely remember, or homes that impress neighbors they don't even like. And the truly heartbreaking part? Most of them aren't even enjoying these purchases. They're experiencing a brief dopamine hit followed by months or years of financial anxiety. They're trading genuine peace of mind for the appearance of having made it. Let me share something with you. When I started earning good money, everyone expected me to upgrade my lifestyle immediately. Move to a bigger place, buy a luxury car, start wearing expensive watches. That's what successful people do, right? I did none of that. I kept my modest apartment. I drove my reliable used car. I wore the same practical clothes. And you know what people said? They said I was cheap. They said I didn't know how to enjoy life. They said success was wasted on me. But here's what they didn't see. I was building something they couldn't comprehend. While they were financing their lifestyles, I was financing my freedom. While they were impressing strangers at restaurants, I was investing in a future where I'd never have to beg anyone for a paycheck. While they were buying temporary status symbols, I was purchasing permanent peace of mind. The true luxury wasn't the car or the watch or the fancy address. The true luxury was knowing that if everything went wrong tomorrow, I'd be fine. The true luxury was sleeping soundly without financial stress gnawing at my consciousness. The true luxury was having choices. And here's the beautiful irony. Once you build real wealth through discipline, you often discover you don't want the things you once thought you needed. Because the freedom itself becomes more valuable than anything money can buy. That's the transformation frugality creates. It shifts you from being a consumer to being a creator of your own life, from being manipulated by clever advertising to being guided by your own values, from being financially fragile to being financially anti-fragile. And here's what most people miss. This isn't about deprivation. It's about liberation. When I was living that consumer life, constantly buying things I thought would make me happy, I felt trapped. Trapped by my job because I needed it to pay for all my stuff. Trapped by my possessions because they owned more of my time and attention than I owned of theirs. Trapped by this exhausting treadmill of work. Spend, want more, work harder. The irony is thick enough to cut with a knife. We think buying things gives us freedom, but it's actually building a prison around us, one purchase at a time. Living below your means is the key that unlocks the cell door. Now, I want to address something important here. There's a massive difference between being cheap and being frugal. Being cheap is about denying yourself things you actually value to save pennies. Being frugal is about refusing to spend money on things that don't align with your values so you can afford what truly matters to you. I'm not cheap. I spend generously on what I care about, but I'm ruthlessly frugal about everything else. I don't buy expensive coffee every morning because, honestly, coffee from home tastes just as good to me and saves me $1,500 a year. But I absolutely spend money on quality tools because I value craftsmanship and they last for decades. I drive an older car because new cars depreciate faster than ice cream melts in July. But I invest in experiences with my family because those memories are appreciated forever. See the difference? It's not about saying no to everything. It's about saying a resounding yes to what matters and an equally resounding no to what doesn't. This requires something our culture actively discourages: knowing yourself, knowing what you actually value, not what advertising tells you to value, not what your neighbors seem to value, not what social media influencers pretend to value while getting paid to promote products. What do you value? I spent years observing this principle in action. A merchant would come to me, lamenting his poverty while wearing a coat with silver buttons. A tradesman would complain about debt while his shop overflowed with the latest fashionable goods gathering dust. They weren't poor because they lacked income, they were poor because they'd never asked themselves this fundamental question. Your values aren't abstract philosophical concepts. They're revealed in how you spend your three most precious resources: time, attention, and money. Show me your bank statement and your calendar, and I'll show you what you truly value, regardless of what you claim to believe. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people inherit their values without examination. You value a large house because your parents valued it. You value a prestigious car because your college friends valued it. You value expensive vacations because advertisements told you to value them. These aren't your values, they're borrowed values, and they're bankrupting you both financially and spiritually. I challenge you to an exercise that changed my life when I was your age. Take a sheet of paper and divide it into 2 columns. In the first column, list everything you spent money on last month. In the second column, write why each purchase mattered to you. Be brutally honest. That restaurant meal, was it nourishment, or was it Instagram content? That subscription service, do you use it, or did you forget it existed? Now, here's the revealing part. Highlight only the purchases that aligned with what you claim to value most. If you say family is your highest value, did your spending reflect that? If you say health matters most, did your money follow your conviction? If you say financial security keeps you awake at night, did you prioritize it when the spending decisions were made? Most people discover a shocking disconnect. They discover they're funding someone else's dream life while neglecting their own values. They're paying for status symbols that impress strangers while ignoring investments that would bring genuine satisfaction. When you align your spending with your authentic values, something miraculous happens. Suddenly, saying no becomes easy. You don't need willpower to decline purchases that don't serve your values, you simply lose interest in them. I discovered this truth while watching wealthy merchants in Philadelphia squander fortunes on things that brought them no lasting satisfaction. They bought to impress, to compete, to fill some nameless void inside themselves. Meanwhile, I spent deliberately on books, on scientific equipment, on ventures that expanded my mind and served my community. My wealth grew because I wasn't bleeding it away on empty displays. This is the secret the modern financial industry doesn't want you to discover. You don't have a discipline problem. You have a clarity problem. Once you're crystal clear on what genuinely matters to you, spending becomes effortless. The right choices become obvious. But here's where most people stumble. They confuse their conditioned desires with their authentic values. They think they value luxury cars because they've been programmed by 1,000 advertisements to associate vehicles with status and self-worth. They think they value designer labels because they've internalized the message that their clothes define their place in society's hierarchy. Let me share something that might sting a bit, but needs to be said. If you removed all external validation from your purchases, if no one would ever see or know what you bought, what would you still choose to spend money on? That question cuts through the noise like a knife. It reveals the difference between what you've been taught to want and what you actually need to feel fulfilled. I'll tell you what I discovered through this exercise. I'd still spend on tools that help me create and learn. I'd still invest in gathering with minds sharper than my own. I'd still fund projects that made my city safer, cleaner, and more enlightened. But the expensive furnishings meant to signal success? Gone. The elaborate social performances? Unnecessary. Is the constant acquisition of new things to maintain an image? Exhausting and pointless. This is liberation. When your spending reflects your soul rather than society's expectations, you break free from the endless treadmill of consumption. You stop being a puppet dancing to the strings of marketers and status anxiety. Let me share something I observed in my printing shop days. I had 2 apprentices, both earned the same wages. One dressed in fine fabrics, frequented taverns, and borrowed money by month's end. The other wore simple clothes, packed bread and cheese for lunch, and within 2 years had saved enough to start his own venture. Same income. Radically different outcomes. The difference wasn't in their earning, it was in their relationship with desire. The boy who succeeded understood what I'm about to tell you. The space between wanting and having is where your power lives. In that gap, you get to decide who you are. Are you the person who folds at the first whisper of temptation? Or are you someone who can sit with desire without being consumed by it? Modern commerce has weaponized this gap against you. They've studied human psychology more thoroughly than I ever studied electricity. They know exactly which neurons to tickle, which insecurities to probe, which aspirations to hijack. Every advertisement is a sophisticated attack on your autonomy, designed to make that gap unbearable, to convince you that waiting is suffering. But here's the truth. They're terrified you'll discover. Delayed gratification isn't deprivation. It's liberation from their control. When you can want something without immediately purchasing it, you're no longer their puppet. You've cut the strings. You're free to ask questions they don't want asked. Do I actually want this? Or do I want the feeling I've been promised? Will this object truly change my life? Or just my bank balance? Is this desire mine? Or has it been manufactured and implanted? I practiced a simple discipline that served me extraordinarily well. When I wanted something beyond my basic needs, I would write it down and wait 30 days. Not as punishment, but as protection. Protection from my own impulsive nature. Most items on that list became invisible within a week. The desire that felt overwhelming on Tuesday had evaporated by the following Monday. Those that remained after 30 days, those were often worth the investment, because they'd proven themselves to be genuine needs or values, rather than passing whims. This practice saved me not just money, but something far more valuable. It saved me from the exhausting tyranny of endless wanting. The difference between want and need becomes crystal clear when you force yourself to wait. A need gnaws at you. It disrupts your work, your sleep, your peace of mind. A want? It fades. It loses its shine when newer, shinier things come along to capture your attention. I once knew a merchant in Philadelphia who prided himself on being first to acquire every new luxury that arrived from England. New style of coat? He bought 3. Novel design of a chair? He ordered a set. Exotic tea service? He had to have it. His home became a museum of momentary enthusiasms, each item representing not a satisfied desire, but merely a pause before the next acquisition. He worked himself to exhaustion not to build something meaningful, but simply to feed an appetite that grew larger with each feeding. When he finally faced bankruptcy, surrounded by rooms full of barely used possessions, he confessed to me that he couldn't remember why he'd wanted most of them in the first place. That's the trap, you see. Consumer culture, whether in my time or yours, thrives on making you forget this waiting period. It profits from impulse. Every advertisement, every limited time offer, every act now, is designed specifically to prevent you from asking yourself that most dangerous question: but do I actually need this? Your modern world has perfected this manipulation. One-click purchasing, same-day delivery, buy now, pay later. The entire infrastructure is built to eliminate friction, to remove any pause that might allow wisdom to enter. The distance between wanting and having has collapsed to nothing. But here's what I learned. That distance, that pause, that space for reflection, that's where financial wisdom lives. That's where you distinguish between building wealth and merely cycling money through your hands. Every dollar you don't spend impulsively is a dollar that can work for you instead of against you. Now, I want you to understand something crucial about modern consumption that would have been unthinkable in my time. In the 18th century, if you wanted something, you had to wait. You saved your coins, you planned, you anticipated. The waiting itself was part of the value equation. A new coat wasn't just fabric and buttons, it was months of deliberation, saving, and finally, satisfaction. Today, you can have nearly anything delivered to your door within hours. The entire infrastructure of commerce has been redesigned to eliminate waiting, to remove that crucial pause where wisdom enters the equation. They call it convenience, but what they've actually engineered is the systematic removal of your natural defense against poor decisions. Think about what happens in your brain when you browse online. You see something appealing. Your desire circuits activate. And before that desire can fade, before reason can intercede, you're clicking buy now. One click. That's all that stands between impulse and purchase. They've studied this exhaustively. Every friction point in the buying process costs them conversions, so they've spent billions removing every obstacle between your want and their sale. I'm not romanticizing scarcity or hardship. I appreciate convenience as much as anyone, but I am warning you about the cost of frictionless consumption. When obtaining something requires no effort, no patience, no sacrifice, it becomes nearly worthless to you psychologically. You accumulate rather than appreciate. You consume rather than savor. I've watched people order items online while simultaneously ignoring identical items they already own, forgotten in closets or storage. The thrill isn't in having the thing, it's in the acquisition itself. You've been conditioned to chase the dopamine hit of purchasing, not the lasting satisfaction of ownership. Here's a practice I recommend, drawn from my own principle of deliberate living: create artificial friction. When you want something, write it down. Don't buy it immediately. Wait 3 days for items under $100. Wait a week for larger purchases. Wait a month for anything truly significant. What you'll discover is remarkable. Many desires simply evaporate given time. The urgency was manufactured, not real. The need was suggested, not genuine. You'll find yourself crossing items off your list with relief, grateful you didn't waste resources on something that wouldn't have enhanced your life. And for those items that survive this waiting period, you'll purchase them with confidence, free from buyer's remorse, knowing the decision was considered rather than compulsive. The mental clarity you'll gain from this practice extends far beyond your shopping habits. When you're not constantly battling impulses, when you're not riding the emotional roller coaster of desire and regret, your mind becomes available for more meaningful pursuits. The energy you once spent justifying purchases or recovering from financial mistakes can now fuel your genuine ambitions. I've watched people transform their entire relationship with money through this single technique. A woman once told me she kept a wish list for 6 months. At the end, she looked at her original entries and laughed. She couldn't remember why she'd wanted most of those items. The few that remained important, she bought without hesitation. But more significantly, she'd saved hundreds that would have been wasted on forgotten desires. Consider how this practice builds what I might call financial immunity. Each time you successfully wait, you strengthen your resistance to manipulation. You become less susceptible to the sophisticated tactics designed to separate you from your money. Marketing loses its power when you've developed the patience to outlast it. Now, the 7th method requires brutal honesty with yourself. Distinguish between investments and expenses. We often deceive ourselves, calling expenses investments to justify them. True investments appreciate or generate returns. Everything else, no matter how we rationalize it, is consumption. That expensive suit might feel like a career investment, but unless you can trace direct revenue to it, it's an expense. A beautiful expense, perhaps a worthwhile one, but an expense nonetheless. The online course that sits unwatched? Not an investment, a purchase you regret? These distinctions matter because they prevent us from fooling ourselves into spending what we can't afford. A genuine investment in yourself might be learning a skill that increases your earning capacity. Books you actually read and apply. Tools that enable you to create value. Education that opens doors previously closed. These do return more than they cost, but only if you extract their value through application. But here's what many misunderstand about investment versus expense. The timing of the return matters profoundly. An investment may take months or years to yield its fruit. The apprentice blacksmith spends years learning his trade before his increased earning power manifests. The farmer plants in spring but harvests in autumn. This delayed gratification is precisely what separates the investor from the consumer. I observe in your modern world an addiction to immediate results. You want the body transformation in 30 days, the business success in 60, the mastery in a single weekend workshop. But true investment, the kind that compounds into genuine wealth, operates on nature's timeline, not your impatience. Consider the education of a physician. 7, 8, perhaps 10 years of intensive study and training, an enormous expense of both money and time. During those years, the medical student earns little or nothing, while peers in other fields accumulate savings and experience. Yet, by age 40, the investment has typically returned itself many times over. The key is having the vision to see beyond the immediate sacrifice to the eventual harvest. Now, let me address a category that confuses many. Maintenance expenses disguised as investments. You call replacing your roof an investment in your home. But is it truly? If the roof were failing, you're simply maintaining the value you already possess, not creating new value. This is an expense, a necessary expense, but an expense nonetheless. The confusion arises because we've been sold a convenient fiction, that all spending on ourselves or our property constitutes investment. It does not. Maintaining what you have is fundamentally different from creating what you don't have. The distinction matters because it affects how you evaluate the decision. True investment creates new capacity, new capability, new value streams. It doesn't merely preserve existing ones. When you repair your tools, you're preserving their utility necessary, but not an investment. When you acquire new tools that enable work previously impossible, that's an investment. This lens clarifies many financial decisions that plague modern households. The new car that replaces your functioning vehicle? Expense, unless it genuinely enables income you couldn't otherwise earn. The membership to that exclusive club where business supposedly happens? Ask yourself, honestly, has a single contract materialized from those luncheons? Or have you merely purchased the comfortable illusion of networking? I watched a merchant in Philadelphia maintain membership at 3 separate guilds, each requiring substantial annual dues. He spoke endlessly of connections and opportunities. Yet when I examined his ledgers, not 1 shilling of business traced back to these memberships. He was purchasing belongings, not investing in growth. There is no shame in community, but call it what it is. The expense of social comfort, not the investment of business strategy. The distinction becomes clearer with practice. That certification program, investment or expense, depends entirely on whether it opens doors currently closed to you. If you're a physician seeking a specialized skill that attracts higher-paying patients, consider an investment. If you're collecting credentials to feel accomplished while your practice remains unchanged, expensive decoration, here's where it becomes uncomfortable. Sometimes the most honest accounting reveals that what we've called investments were actually expenses all along. That business venture you funded? If 5 years have passed with no return and no realistic prospect of one, it has been an expensive lesson, not an investment. The courage to reclassify changes everything. It stops you from throwing good money after bad, from protecting an investment that was actually consumption from the start. I must address a modern confusion that Benjamin Franklin never faced the investment that masquerades as expense through deliberate complexity. Your employer offers something called a matching contribution to your retirement account. You must contribute your own money to receive theirs. I've watched workers decline this arrangement, calling it an expense they cannot afford. Let me be plain. If your employer offers to match your retirement contributions, you have discovered perhaps the finest investment available to common folk in your entire economy. They are offering you immediate, guaranteed returns of 50 to 100%. There is no stock, no property, no business venture that can promise such terms. If you decline this while purchasing coffee from shops daily, you have confused expense and investment so thoroughly that poverty becomes nearly inevitable. Consider the mathematics. You deposit $100. Your employer immediately adds another 100. Before a single day of market returns, you've doubled your money. Where else does such an opportunity exist? Yet, I've spoken with workers who reject this gift while simultaneously complaining they cannot get ahead. The mathematics of rejection confounds me. A worker earning $50,000 annually who declines a 6% match refuses $3,000. Not a rebate requiring forms. Not a discount requiring research. Free money for checking a box and naming a percentage. Over 30 years of labor, that's 3,000 compounds. At historical market returns, it becomes not 3,000, but 10, 15, perhaps 20,000. Multiply that by 30 years of matching contributions. We approach $600,000 left on the table because the paperwork seemed inconvenient. I have witnessed the excuses. I cannot afford to reduce my paycheck. This is from individuals carrying subscriptions they never use, financing vehicles beyond their needs, and treating restaurants as primary kitchens. The same person who claims poverty when contributions arise will spend $30 on prepared food without contemplation. The market seems too risky. Yet these cautious souls accept the certainty of poverty in retirement over the possibility of market fluctuation. They choose guaranteed failure to avoid potential setbacks. This is not risk management. This is financial self-sabotage dressed as prudence. I don't understand investing. Neither did you understand your smartphone initially, yet through daily use, mastery emerged. Financial ignorance persists only when we treat it as immutable rather than solvable. The matched contribution requires no expertise, only the willingness to accept generosity. Consider the opportunity through another lens. Your employer offers you a guaranteed 50 to 100% return before market forces even apply. Should you contribute $3,000, they contribute $3,000. That first $3,000 requires no investment genius, no market timing, no risk tolerance. It simply requires saying yes. Then, those combined $6,000 enter markets that have, despite crashes and corrections, delivered average annual returns approaching 10% over extended periods. Not every year. Not without volatility. But across the decades that define working lives, the trajectory ascends. The worker who rejects this compounds not wealth but regret. Each year, without participation, is a year that cannot be recovered. Time remains the irreplaceable ingredient in compound growth. Miss a decade of matching contributions in your 30s, and no amount of later discipline fully compensates. The mathematics prove unforgiving. A 30-year-old who delays retirement savings by 10 years must often contribute nearly double the percentage of their income in their 40s to reach the same outcome. The window of compounding advantage closes incrementally with each passing year. Yet I encounter a peculiar modern phenomenon: young professionals who meticulously budget for streaming services and coffee subscriptions, but treat retirement contributions as optional luxuries to be considered someday. They calculate the monthly cost of everything except their own future security. This represents a fundamental misunderstanding of personal economics. Retirement savings should not be treated as discretionary spending to be addressed after all other desires are satisfied. It functions as essential infrastructure, the foundation upon which all plans must rest. Consider this framework. Before calculating what you can afford to spend, first calculate what you cannot afford not to save. The retirement contribution should be the first withdrawal from each paycheck, not whatever remains after expenses. Pay yourself first, as modern advisors advocate wisdom as old as commerce itself. Many young workers resist this discipline, arguing they need every dollar for present necessities. Yet these same individuals often carry remarkable spending in categories that provided little lasting value even to their younger selves. The designer handbag gathering dust in a closet represented months of retirement contributions lost to vanity. I do not advocate for joyless frugality or monastic denial. Rather, I suggest conscious prioritization. Every financial decision represents a choice between present consumption and future security. Both have value, but the balance in youth tilts heavily toward choices that benefit from time's multiplication effect. The workplace retirement account offers advantages beyond the employer match. Money deposited before taxation reduces your current tax burden while growing tax-deferred. A young professional in a modest tax bracket who contributes $5,000 actually reduces their take-home pay by perhaps $3,500. The government effectively subsidizes their retirement savings. This tax architecture was designed specifically to encourage the very behavior I advocate. Yet millions of eligible workers contribute nothing, leaving both employer matches and tax advantages unclaimed. They effectively refuse free money due to inertia or misunderstanding. I understand the psychological resistance. Retirement seems impossibly distant to a 25-year-old. The mental exercise of imagining oneself at 70 requires uncomfortable contemplation of mortality and aging, far easier to focus on immediate concerns and defer these unsettling thoughts. But this avoidance compounds with interest as damaging as any financial penalty. The third barrier proves perhaps most insidious: the modern cult of youth worship. Your culture venerates the young with an intensity that would have seemed peculiar in my era. Every advertisement features smooth skin and boundless energy. Your entertainment celebrates rebellion and novelty, while portraying age as decline, irrelevance, something to be fought with surgeries and potions rather than embraced with dignity. This societal messaging creates a psychological blind spot. When culture constantly reinforces youth as the ideal state, planning for age feels like admitting defeat. It's akin to acknowledging winter's inevitable arrival when society insists spring can last forever. Young people naturally struggle to envision themselves old when every mirror, screen, and billboard suggests youth is permanent, or should be. I observe this phenomenon even in my time, though less pronounced. The difference? We lacked your technological capacity to maintain the illusion. At 30, one had already witnessed enough death, illness, and aging to accept life's trajectory. Your medical advances, wonderful as they are, create an expectation of perpetual vitality that makes eventual decline more shocking, less anticipated. The fourth obstacle involves what I'll call the tyranny of the urgent. Your modern existence operates at a pace I could scarcely have imagined. My printing press seemed revolutionary. Now information travels globally in seconds. This acceleration creates constant urgency emails, requiring immediate response, notifications demanding attention, crises both real and manufactured, competing for your mental bandwidth. Against this backdrop of manufactured urgency, retirement planning feels abstract and distant. It generates no pings, no alerts, no red exclamation marks. The consequences of neglect accumulate silently while immediate demands scream for attention. It's the essence of Stephen Covey's important versus urgent matrix, a framework that would have saved me considerable mental effort had someone articulated it in my youth. This leads to the fifth barrier: decision paralysis born of excessive choice. In my era, retirement planning was straightforward: save what you could, invest in land or reliable enterprises, and hope for the best. You face thousands of investment vehicles, countless strategies, conflicting expert opinions, and regulatory complexities that require specialized knowledge to navigate. This abundance of options, paradoxically, leads to inaction. Psychological research unavailable in my time but fascinating nonetheless demonstrates that excessive choice overwhelms the decision-making apparatus. Faced with 30 varieties of jam, people buy none. Confronted with hundreds of investment options and contradictory advice, young workers freeze, selecting nothing or defaulting to whatever their employer suggests without comprehension. The paralysis extends beyond retirement accounts. I observe young people agonizing over career paths with an intensity that borders on debilitating. In my era, options were limited by geography, family trade, and social station constraints I often chafed against, certainly, but which paradoxically simplified certain decisions. A printer's son in Boston had perhaps 3 or 4 realistic paths forward. Today's graduate faces thousands of potential careers, many of which didn't exist 5 years prior and may vanish 5 years hence. This abundance masquerades as freedom but functions as a cage of indecision. I've watched bright young minds spend years in analysis, comparing paths, seeking the optimal choice, while time, that non-renewable resource I mentioned earlier, evaporates. They forget what I learned in my printing shop. Action generates information that contemplation cannot. I didn't know I'd become a statesman when I first set type. I discovered capabilities through doing, through committing to a direction and adjusting course as I learned. The modern fixation on finding one's passion before beginning exemplifies this paralysis. Passion, I found, follows mastery more often than it precedes it. I wasn't born passionate about electricity. I became fascinated through experimentation, through the satisfaction of understanding something previously mysterious. I didn't enter printing because it set my soul aflame. I grew to love it through the development of skill and the recognition of its power to spread knowledge. Yet today's advice constantly urges young people to follow their passion, as though it's a pre-existing North Star rather than something cultivated through engagement and competence. This advice, well-intentioned as it may be, contributes to the paralysis. They wait for certainty that cannot come, for a feeling that arrives only after commitment and effort. The retirement system compounds this by demanding decisions in youth about circumstances decades distant. At 22, freshly employed, you're asked to envision your life at 70 and allocate resources accordingly. This would be challenging enough without the bewildering array of options, but combined with choice overload, it becomes nearly impossible to navigate thoughtfully. I've observed how this complexity serves certain interests. Financial institutions profit from confusion. The more bewildering the landscape, the more desperate people become for guidance, and the more willing they are to pay for it. Fund managers charge fees that seem modest in isolation, 1% here, 0.5% there, but compound devastatingly over decades. A young person investing $50,000 who pays just 1% annually in fees will surrender nearly 30% of their final balance over 40 years. They're essentially working an entire decade for the financial industry rather than themselves. The obfuscation is often deliberate. I've read prospectuses that seem designed to confound rather than clarify, written in language so technical and dense that even educated investors struggle to understand what they're purchasing. Target date funds promise simplicity but hide layers of fees and questionable assumptions about risk tolerance. Actively managed funds tout past performance, while disclaimers whisper what everyone knows but few internalize. Past returns predict nothing about the future. Meanwhile, the evidence increasingly suggests that the simplest approach, low-cost index funds, requiring minimal decision-making, outperforms the vast majority of complex strategies. Yet this straightforward path generates insufficient revenue for the industry, so it's rarely the loudest recommendation you'll encounter. The psychological burden of this system extends beyond mere confusion. There's a peculiar anxiety that comes from knowing your future security depends on decisions you're unqualified to make. You're not a financial analyst, yet you're expected to function as one. You're not an economist, yet you must forecast inflation, returns, and your own longevity. The responsibility feels simultaneously crucial and impossible, creating a paralysis where many simply avoid the decisions entirely, defaulting to whatever option requires the least immediate thought. This avoidance, of course, becomes its own decision, usually an expensive one. Leaving retirement funds in cash equivalents or failing to capture employer matching contributions can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars over a working life. The fascinating irony is that historically, humans didn't struggle with these decisions because most people never made them. Financial complexity was reserved for merchants, landowners, and the wealthy. The average person worked until they couldn't, relied on family or community support, and died relatively young by modern standards. There was no 401k versus IRA debate because there was no such thing as a 30-year retirement. We've essentially democratized financial complexity without democratizing financial education. It's like handing everyone a pilot's license without teaching them to fly, then expressing surprise when most people choose to stay on the ground. The tools of wealth building that were once accessible only to the privileged few are now theoretically available to everyone, but the knowledge required to use them effectively remains concentrated among specialists. This creates what I call the accessibility paradox. The more options available, the less accessible the system becomes psychologically. A person with one retirement account choice will make a decision. A person with 15 choices, each with its own rules, tax implications, withdrawal restrictions, and fee structures, will often make none at all. They freeze, overwhelmed by the potential for choosing wrong. And, unlike most forms of paralysis, this one compounds exponentially. Every month of indecision isn't just a neutral pause, it's a mathematical regression, The contributions unmade don't simply disappear. They take with them all the future growth they would have generated. $1,000 not invested at age 25 doesn't cost you $1,000 at retirement. It costs you approximately $15,000, assuming historical market returns. The decision not to decide is among the most expensive choices a person can make. Yet we rarely frame it this way. Financial advice tends toward the encouraging. It's never too late to start. While technically true, starting late is better than never starting, this optimism obscures a harder truth. It is, mathematically speaking, much too late once you've lost decades of compound growth. The person who begins investing seriously at 50 faces a fundamentally different challenge than the person who began at 25, requiring either dramatically higher contribution rates or dramatically lower retirement expectations. The illusion persists because the advice industry profits from hope. Financial advisors, retirement planners, investment newsletters, they all share a vested interest in convincing you that salvation remains possible regardless of your starting point. To acknowledge that someone in their 50s with minimal savings faces genuinely constrained options would be to admit that much of the industry's value proposition arrives too late for many of its clients. Consider the mathematics plainly. A 25-year-old who invests $500 monthly until 65, assuming a 7% annual return, accumulates approximately $1.2 million. The 50-year-old, starting with the same contribution, reaches 65 with roughly $200,000, one-sixth the total, despite contributing 3/4 as many months. To match that million-dollar figure, our late starter would need to contribute nearly $3,000 monthly, a six-fold increase that may simply exceed what their budget allows. This isn't pessimism, it's arithmetic. And yet the predominant message remains relentlessly upbeat, as though willpower and determination could overcome the exponential function itself. I watched this dynamic play out with a family friend who didn't seriously address retirement until his mid-50s. Every consultation with financial professionals yielded the same encouraging framework. Maximize contributions, delay Social Security, consider part-time work in retirement. All sensible suggestions, certainly, but none that actually bridged the gap between his circumstances and the retirement he'd imagined. The advice was technically correct, yet functionally inadequate, like telling someone who missed their train that if they run very fast, they might still catch it, when the train departed an hour ago. The conspiracy, such as it is, lies not in active deception, but in the systematic omission of uncomfortable truths. Yes, you should start now, regardless of your age. But no, starting now will not produce the same outcomes that starting earlier would have produced. That compounding works both ways magnificently in your favor when given time, mercilessly against you when time has elapsed remains the part they whisper rather than shout. The young man who begins investing at 25 puts aside $200 monthly for 10 years, then stops completely. The second man waits until 35, then invests $200 monthly for 30 years, 3 times as long, 3 times the total contribution. At age 65, assuming identical returns, the first man who stopped at 35 possesses more wealth than the second, who contributed faithfully for 3 decades. This mathematical reality feels unjust until you recognize it as neither punishment nor reward, but simply the architecture of exponential growth. The first decade of compound returns establishes foundations upon which subsequent decades build cathedrals. The final decade adds impressive absolute numbers but cannot replicate the multiplicative magic that the early years provide. I witnessed this pattern repeatedly in Philadelphia's merchant class. The young apprentice, who purchased a small share in a trading vessel at age 20, then never invested another shilling, often accumulated more maritime wealth than the established merchant, who began serious investment at 40, with 10 times the capital. The decades themselves possessed value that money could not purchase retroactively. Yet here lies where I must speak plainly about something the financial priesthood rarely addresses: the profound unfairness embedded within this truth. A child born to educated parents who understand these principles, who establish accounts before their offspring can speak, who automate contributions from privileged income streams, this child enters adulthood with mathematical advantages that no amount of later discipline can fully overcome. Meanwhile, the young person working 2 jobs to support a family, lacking financial literacy because their parents lacked it, starting from 0 at 30, because survival demanded it, They face not merely a steeper climb, but a fundamentally altered mathematical landscape. The truth about compound interest contains this uncomfortable duality. It is simultaneously the great equalizer and the great divider. Available to anyone with access to markets, yet most powerful for those who possess resources and knowledge earliest. This does not render the principle useless for those starting late. Far from it. That same person beginning at 30 can still build significant wealth by 60. They simply cannot build the same wealth that beginning at 20 would have produced, regardless of their later efforts. The mathematics show neither mercy nor malice, they simply are. The tragedy compounds when we consider not just individual fortunes, but generational wealth, the true measure of compounding's ultimate power. When I established the Franklin Fund in Boston and Philadelphia, I structured it to compound for 200 years. The first 100 years would benefit one generation, the second 100 another. This wasn't mere eccentricity. It was recognition that compound interest, given sufficient time, doesn't just change individual lives, it transforms entire family lines for centuries. Consider the mathematics of generational compounding. A person who builds wealth and passes it to children who continue the compounding creates an exponential advantage. The grandchildren inherit not just money, but decades of accumulated compound growth. The great-grandchildren receive the fruits of a century of compounding. This creates what economists now call path dependence, where your starting position dramatically influences your ending destination, regardless of effort or merit. A child born into a family that began serious compounding 3 generations prior enters life with mathematical advantages that no amount of personal hustle can overcome within a single lifetime. I watch this reality create increasing friction in society. Those who understand generational compounding build dynasties. Those who don't remain trapped in what they call the rat race, working ceaselessly yet never achieving the escape velocity that compounding provides. The solution isn't to abandon effort or bemoan unfairness. Mathematics cares nothing for our sense of justice. They simply compound according to their immutable laws. The solution is to begin immediately, regardless of starting position. To recognize that while you cannot recover lost decades, you can prevent losing additional ones. To understand that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is today, and that tomorrow becomes a worse option with each passing sunrise. I've observed people spend years paralyzed by regret over missed opportunities, years they could have spent building new compounding positions. This is perhaps the cruelest irony, losing additional compounding time to grief over already lost compounding time. The mathematics suggest a different approach. Accept past losses as permanent, then immediately redirect all energy toward maximizing remaining compounding periods. Calculate your actual runway. If you're 30 with 35 working years remaining, you still command substantial compounding power. Use it. Time wasted rebuilding wealth squandered in youth cannot be reclaimed. This is the cruel mathematics of financial negligence. I watch talented individuals earning impressive salaries vanish into financial obscurity, not from insufficient income, but from the systematic sabotage of their own prosperity through accumulated ignorance and manufactured urgency. Your earning years possess finite boundaries. The energy you command at 25 will not accompany you to 65. Plan accordingly. The prosperity ladder extends rungs you cannot perceive from your current elevation. Each financial level unlocks opportunities invisible from below. This creates acceleration, building wealth through access rather than merely through returns. Connections, deals, partnerships, and opportunities cluster at higher financial altitudes. This explains why wealth compounds non-linearly. The gap between comfortable and wealthy involves different rules, different access, and different velocity. Your initial objective should be escaping paycheck dependency. This means building reserves sufficient to withstand employment interruption without immediate crisis. 6 months of expenses represent the minimum threshold for basic financial breathing room. This reserve is not wealth, it is merely the absence of immediate vulnerability. Yet most never achieve even this modest milestone, living perpetually one mishap away from financial catastrophe. Beyond emergency reserves lies investment capital money, deployed to generate additional money without your active labor. This is where wealth construction actually begins. The transition from saver to investor represents a psychological threshold many may never cross. They accumulate but never deploy, watching inflation slowly erode their caution into poverty. Investment requires accepting calculated risk. Money hidden achieves safety, but sacrifices growth. Money deployed accepts uncertainty, but purchases possibility. Your risk tolerance should correlate with your timeline. Decades ahead permit aggressive positioning. Years ahead demand conservative protection. Yet I observed young people investing like retirees and retirees gambling like adolescents precisely backward. Understand that market volatility is the price you pay for market returns. Elimination of fluctuation requires elimination of growth. These are not separate choices. The emotional discipline required for successful investing exceeds the intellectual demands. Knowledge means little when panic drives selling at losses or greed drives buying at peaks. Your behavior determines your returns more than your selections. Average investments held with discipline outperform excellent investments traded emotionally. The marketplace tests not merely your analytical skills, but your self-knowledge. The investor who understands their own psychology holds an advantage over the investor who merely understands economics. I have watched brilliant minds destroy wealth they spent decades building because they failed to recognize their emotional patterns. Consider the investor who claims patience yet checks portfolio values hourly. Their stated strategy conflicts with their actual behavior. This internal contradiction creates decision-making based on whatever emotion dominates at the moment of checking. They sell when 3 consecutive checks show a decline, buy when 3 show an increase. Their returns reflect not market performance, but their checking frequency. Your investment approach must align with your genuine temperament, not your idealized self-image. If market volatility disrupts your sleep, your portfolio contains too much risk, regardless of what calculators suggest you can tolerate. If you feel compelled to act on every news headline, you need systems that make frequent action impossible. Self-awareness prevents expensive mistakes. The psychological challenge intensifies because investing rewards behaviors that feel wrong. Buying when markets decline feels like throwing money into a fire. Holding through volatility feels like negligence when you could do something to stop the pain. Ignoring exciting opportunities feels like cowardice when everyone else seems to be getting rich. Yet these uncomfortable disciplines produce the outcomes most investors claim they want. I developed what I called emotional hedging building practices that protected me from my own worst impulses. I automated investments so market conditions could not influence contribution amounts. I established rules that required waiting periods before selling anything, creating friction between impulse and action. I deliberately made it inconvenient to access investment accounts, reducing the temptation to tinker. These barriers seemed excessive to many observers. Why make investing harder when technology makes it easier? Because ease of action benefits those who make wise decisions, but devastates those prone to emotional reactions. Most investors need protection from their own convenience. The greatest investors I studied shared this recognition. They built moats not just around their investments, but around their decision-making processes. They understood that discipline stems not from willpower, which depletes, but from systems that make disciplined behavior the path of least resistance. Your investment success depends less on finding perfect opportunities than on preventing perfect mistakes. The opportunity you miss costs far less than the mistake you make. This truth offends those who believe aggression and action demonstrate skill, yet mathematics confirms it relentlessly. The defensive investor recognizes what the aggressive investor never admits, that knowing when not to act requires greater wisdom than knowing when to act. I built my fortune not through spectacular victories but through the systematic avoidance of spectacular defeats. While others chased the brilliant opportunity that would change everything, I protected the modest gains that compounded into everything worth having. Consider the investor who made 15 decisions in a year. 14 proved modestly profitable, returning between 5 and 12%. The 15th, pursued with confidence and conviction, lost 60%. The mathematics are unforgiving. That single mistake erased 3 years of careful gains. Yet this investor will recount tales of the 14 successes while dismissing the catastrophic failure as bad luck, an unforeseeable event, an exception that proves nothing about their process. This is the delusion that separates the wealthy from the perpetually striving. Your process is revealed not by your winners but by your worst mistake. The strategy that protects you from catastrophe, while capturing modest gains, will always outperform the strategy that captures spectacular gains while exposing you to catastrophe. Time makes this distinction absolute. I watch investors construct elaborate systems for identifying opportunities while barely giving a thought to identifying risks. They develop models for what to buy, when to buy, and how much to buy. But the question of what not to buy, what circumstances justify selling, what losses they refuse to accept, these receive cursory attention, as though risk management were the unglamorous stepchild of investment strategy rather than its essential foundation. The truth these investors avoid. The opportunities you correctly identify matter less than the disasters you successfully avoid. One catastrophic loss requires years of gains to overcome, and those years grant you nothing but recovery of the position you already held. Time spent recovering from preventable mistakes is time stolen from compounding actual wealth. The prudent investor, therefore, adopts what appears to the ambitious as excessive caution. They pass up opportunities their peers pursue with enthusiasm. They endure the social discomfort of watching others celebrate gains while they sit idle. This requires a particular courage, the courage to appear foolish before the outcome reveals wisdom. I observed this pattern throughout my years. The printer that expanded too rapidly when paper prices fell, only to face ruin when prices normalized. The merchant who leveraged his entire capital during a boom, only to lose everything in the inevitable correction. Meanwhile, the merchant who declined those same opportunities, who accepted smaller gains with smaller risks, who moved forward steadily rather than spectacularly, this merchant still operated his business decades later, his wealth compounding quietly, while more ambitious competitors cycled through bankruptcy and recovery. You face an environment that weaponizes this social pressure. Every platform displays the gains of others, curated and amplified. Every conversation among investors gravitates toward recent successes, never toward the near misses and avoided disasters that truly distinguish the competent from the lucky. You see the profits others captured, never the risks they accepted to capture them. This creates a distorted reference point that makes prudence appear as timidity and recklessness appear as boldness. The successful investor develops immunity to this pressure. They recognize that most investing behavior emerges not from rational analysis, but from emotional management, specifically the management of social emotions like envy, embarrassment, and status anxiety. When you catch yourself considering an investment primarily because others have profited from it, you have identified a decision driven by emotion rather than analysis. The remedy is not to suppress these emotions, which proves impossible, but to recognize them as signals that you are operating outside your genuine understanding. I learned to ask myself before any significant commitment, am I acting from knowledge or from fear of missing what others have gained? When the honest answer was the latter, I declined the opportunity, regardless of how compelling it appeared. This practice cost me numerous gains over the years. It also spared me numerous disasters. On balance, the disasters avoided contributed far more to my accumulated wealth than the gains I captured. The merchants who mocked my caution during the South Sea speculation eventually faced ruin. I remained solvent. The speculators who ridiculed my refusal to purchase Louisiana wilderness certificates on credit eventually lost everything. I maintained my position. This was not genius, it was simply the systematic application of a defensive principle that protected my foundation while others gambled theirs away. Let me address now the third element that separates sustainable wealth building from spectacular collapse: the ability to think in decades rather than months. The tyranny of the immediate is perhaps the most seductive destroyer of long-term prosperity. I have watched countless individuals sacrifice enduring advantages for temporary satisfactions, trading their future selves for present gratification with remarkable consistency. This failure of temporal perspective manifests in thousands of small decisions. The merchant who depletes his reserves to purchase an impressive carriage. The tradesman who borrows against future earnings to finance current consumption. The investor who abandons a sound 20-year strategy because of a difficult 6-month period. I implemented a mental practice that proved invaluable. Before making any significant financial decision, I would write a letter to my future self 10 years hence, explaining and justifying the choice. This exercise forced me to confront the long-term implications of short-term actions. When I considered expanding my printing operation in 1743, my immediate circumstances suggested caution. Business was adequate but not exceptional. The expense would strain my resources. Most advisors would have counseled delay, but my letter to my future self painted a different picture. 10 years forward, the question was not whether the expansion would inconvenience me in 1743, but whether it would position me advantageously in 1753. From that perspective, the decision was clarified immediately. The expansion proceeded. The temporary strain lasted 18 months. The competitive advantage lasted 18 years. This long-horizon thinking created compounding benefits that short-term optimization could never achieve. Each decision made with a decade in mind was built upon previous decisions made with the same temporal framework, creating an architecture of advantage that only became apparent across extended timeframes. The remarkable thing about this extended temporal advantage is that it became self-reinforcing. Each year of maintaining a competitive position provided resources and insights that further extended the advantage. The company that thinks in decades doesn't just compete better, it operates in an entirely different strategic dimension than competitors trapped in quarterly thinking. I have watched this pattern repeat across centuries with perfect consistency. The institutions that endure are never those optimizing for immediate visibility. They are those making deposits in accounts that won't mature for years. Consider my own approach to civic improvement. When I proposed the subscription library in 1731, I did not measure success by first-month membership. I envisioned generations of citizens with access to knowledge that would compound across lifetimes. That library still operates today, nearly 3 centuries later, having educated millions. The return on that initial effort has compounded beyond any calculation I could have made. The modern resistance to delayed gratification creates an extraordinary opportunity for those willing to embrace longer timeframes. In a world optimizing for this quarter's results, the person optimizing for this decade's foundation possesses an almost unfair advantage. Your competitors are asking, "What can we launch this month?" You should be asking, "What capability, if we built it consistently for 3 years, would make us unbeatable?" These are entirely different questions leading to entirely different decisions. I observe entrepreneurs building audiences by chasing each week's trending topic, gaining temporary attention that evaporates as quickly as morning frost. Meanwhile, others build systematic expertise in a specific domain, publishing consistently for years, creating a body of work that becomes more valuable with each edition. 5 years later, the trend chaser is exhausted and forgotten. The systematic builder has become the definitive voice in their field. The difference was not talent or effort. It was a temporal orientation. This principle applies equally to skill development. The person who studies their craft 30 minutes daily for 5 years will surpass the person who sporadically dedicates entire weeks to intensive practice. Consistency across extended time frames defeats intensity across brief periods. I built my printing business, not through spectacular quarterly innovations but through daily operational excellence sustained across decades. Each day's quality work was individually unremarkable. Accumulated across years, it became an unassailable reputation. This principle applies equally to personal development. When I began my self-improvement project at age 20, I didn't attempt dramatic personality reconstruction. I identified 13 virtues and worked on 1 per week, cycling through the list 4 times annually. Was this glamorous? Hardly. Did acquaintances notice weekly changes? Never. Yet over 5 years, the accumulated effect fundamentally reshaped my character in ways no intensive short-term program could match. Your modern fitness culture illustrates this beautifully. Those who transform their health sustainably don't do so through extreme 30-day challenges that promise miraculous results. They build simple routines, a morning walk, consistent sleep schedules, gradual dietary improvements that individually seem almost trivial. 6 months later, the compound effect renders them unrecognizable. Meanwhile, those who pursued dramatic transformations have typically returned to baseline, sometimes worse off than before. Consider skill acquisition. I learned French not through immersive crash courses but through 15 minutes of daily practice sustained across years. Each session taught me perhaps 5 new words, reviewed 20 previous ones, and clarified 1 grammatical concept, individually insignificant, collectively transformative. After 3 years of this unremarkable daily practice, I could conduct business negotiations and read philosophy in French, not through heroic effort but through patient accumulation. The mathematical reality is inescapable. Dramatic efforts produce linear results at best, often declining returns as initial enthusiasm wanes. Consistent small efforts produce exponential results through compound effects. A 10% improvement sustained over time vastly outperforms sporadic 100% efforts. These compounds cross domains. My electrical experiments succeeded not because I conducted spectacular one-time demonstrations, but because I performed hundreds of small, methodical tests, each slightly refining my understanding. My diplomatic success emerged not from brilliant individual negotiations, but from decades of relationship building, each conversation adding another thread to a complex web of trust and influence. The question before you now is not whether this principle is true, you've seen enough evidence, but whether you possess the patience to apply it. And patience, I discovered, is not passive waiting. It is active endurance while maintaining steady effort. There is a profound difference. When I operated my printing shop, I did not merely wait for success to arrive. I rose before dawn, worked past midnight, cultivated every customer relationship, and honored every deadline, no matter how small. I was patient with the timeline of success while being impatient with my own daily effort. This is the paradox. You must be urgent about today's work, while being patient about tomorrow's results. Most abandon their compound efforts precisely when the accumulation is about to become visible. They plant seeds, water them faithfully for weeks, then uproot everything just before the shoot would break through the soil. I have witnessed this tragedy countless times: the writer who stops after 9 chapters of a 10-chapter book, the inventor who abandons his prototype after the 4th iteration when the 5th would have succeeded, the apprentice who quits 3 months before mastering his craft. The turning point is rarely visible while you're approaching it. When I was perfecting the lightning rod, I had no way of knowing which experiment would yield the crucial insight. Had I stopped after 50 trials instead of 60, the breakthrough would have belonged to someone else. The distance between obscurity and accomplishment is often no more than a dozen additional attempts. This is why commitment to process matters more than enthusiasm about outcomes. Enthusiasm fluctuates with circumstances, but commitment persists regardless. In my years of public service, there were countless mornings when I felt no enthusiasm whatsoever for the tedious work ahead: another budgetary meeting, another compromise negotiation, another letter to a difficult correspondent. But my commitment never wavered, and it was those uninspired, faithful days of work that built the foundation for whatever historical significance my efforts achieved. Consider the profound implications. You need not be brilliant today. You need not revolutionize your field this week. You need only show up tomorrow and continue. Then repeat. The compound mechanism requires only consistency and time. Everything else, talent, circumstances, luck, merely adjusts the rate, not the fundamental principle.